FICRA for Studies and Development, FICRA SD, is an independent, nonpartisan Sudanese research center and policy organization dedicated to advancing peace, progress, and knowledge, promoting democratic transformation, and supporting sustainable development in Sudan and the wider region. Sudanese Dialogues is the signature podcast from FICRA SD, brings you in-depth analysis and sharp insight into Sudan's latest developments and unfolding dynamics. Welcome to a brand new episode of Sudanese Dialogues. Let's dive in.
You know, the conflict in Sudan is incredibly complex. It's huge. But there's one really clear fact that cuts right through all the noise. Since April 2023, civilians are overwhelmingly fleeing away from areas controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, and they're moving towards territory held by the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF. Now, this isn't random. It's a massive, directional movement of people trying to escape something truly intolerable. And the data, well, the data tells us exactly why.
Okay, so look at this. The data paints a picture that is just stark. According to independent monitoring, a staggering 88% of civilian deaths are attributed to the RSF. This isn't some 50-50 fight when you look at who is harming civilians. The evidence is pointing overwhelmingly in one direction. And a statistic like that, it just forces you to ask a really important question.
So why? Why this massive exodus? Why are people risking absolutely everything to move towards one side of the conflict line and not the other? The answer isn't that they're running towards some kind of perfect safety. The thing is, they are running from a very specific, a very systematic, and frankly, a predictable set of threats. And to really understand this, we need to zoom in from these big numbers to what's happening on the ground.
And the place that tells this story most powerfully right now is the city of Fasher in North Darfur. The suffering there, it's not just some tragic side effect of war. No, it is a direct result of very specific military tactics. The siege of Fasher gives us this terrifyingly clear window into the human cost behind those numbers we just saw.
And this is absolutely crucial. What has happened in Fasher is not some kind of anomaly. The sources we're looking at tell us it's basically a template. It's an operational model for how the RSF conducts sieges, how they control people's movement, and how they block aid all across Darfur. So as we're looking at the details from this one city, what we're really seeing is a strategy that has been used again and again.
So what is life like inside this siege? Well, civilian life has pretty much collapsed. We're talking about a daily reality of shells landing in homes and markets totally indiscriminately. Systematic house-to-house looting. Hospitals, the one place you think would be safe, they're not even functional anymore. Mass sexual violence and abductions are rampant. And when the food runs out, people are forced to do the unthinkable, like eating animal feed just to survive.
And then you hear reports of atrocities that are almost impossible to comprehend. This quote from eyewitnesses describes something horrifyingly new, where militias are forcibly taking large amounts of blood from civilians they've captured. This isn't just random, chaotic brutality. This is a methodical, systematic violation of human life. And it just shows you the nature of the violence that people are trying to escape.
So what happens if you try to get out? Well, the act of escaping has been turned into a weapon against you. First, fighters extort you, charging taxes to people who are desperate to flee. Your survival becomes a business transaction. Then if you get into a convoy, those convoys are ambushed at checkpoints. And finally, people are just executed, killed on the spot, accused of supporting the army. There is literally no safe way out.
And this brings us right back to that impossible choice we talked about. When you have this level of predation behind you, you are forced to weigh the risks and find a place that is, well, relatively safe, even if that safety is fragile and comes with its own set of very serious dangers.
So you end up with this harrowing trade-off. In RSF-controlled areas, the threat is systematic predation. It's ethnic targeting. It's the total collapse of basic services. In SAF-controlled areas, you might find some stability, but let's be clear, it is not truly safe. The risks are still very real, things like indiscriminate airstrikes and arbitrary arrests. But here's the crucial point. Civilians aren't fleeing to a sanctuary. They are fleeing from a kill zone towards a place where survival is just more possible.
Now, when the situation on the ground is this clear, it raises a really big question about the international response. What happens when international players insist on treating both sides as equally responsible for harming civilians, when the evidence is so lopsided? The source material we're drawing from argues that this creates something dangerous called false neutrality.
So what even is false neutrality? Well, it's when you fail to name who's responsible, when the data, like that 88% figure we saw, is undeniable. It might sound impartial, but what it actually does is it means the group committing the vast majority of the atrocities faces no specific pressure. It gives them de facto impunity, which is like a free pass, and it lets the violence just keep going.
And believe me, this approach has real-world costs. It completely hamstrings diplomacy, because how can you target pressure or sanctions if you refuse to name the target? It leads to paralysis for aid groups who can't plan for specific threats if they're not allowed to talk about who is posing the threat. And maybe worst of all, it undermines any future hope for justice, because you're blurring the record of who did what right from the start.
Okay, so if false neutrality is the problem, what's the solution? The sources lay out an alternative. It's a path forward that is centered on the evidence and focused on the practical needs of civilians right now.
And the recommendations are really clear and they're phased. So immediately, in the next 3 months, the priority has to be saving lives. That means getting aid into these besieged cities and scaling up specialized health services. In the short term, the focus shifts to carefully planned, voluntary returns, but, and this is a big but, only when it's actually safe. And then long-term, the goal has to be building a real foundation for justice and accountability so these crimes don't just go unpunished.
And that brings us to our final thought here. This entire crisis, the flight of millions of people, the siege of entire cities, the systematic violence, it's all documented. The patterns are known. Which leaves us with a final, really challenging question to think about. When the evidence of atrocities is this clear, what is the true cost of silence?